traditional healing practices such as ukuthwasa. Now the question remains, however, in terms of how to discern the right treatment for one's symptoms. And are these treatment options mutually exclusive? Well, we've got Charity Mukono, who's a clinical psychologist at the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, whilst Mkhulu Makhanya is a practicing Sangoma, and they're joining us now for that discussion. Thanks a lot for joining us on a Newsnight this evening.
Thank you.
Now, Charity, let's start off with you. I mean, World Health Organization is saying that suicide occurs every 40 seconds and an attempt is made every 3 seconds. So you and I are having a conversation. How many attempts have already been made currently just from that? That is startling.
It is startling. And I think if we narrow it down to South Africa, the stats as they currently stand is that 460 people commit suicide. There are 460 successful suicides in South Africa.
Per annum?
No. Per day.
Per day?
Yes.
Oh,
with men being higher at successful attempts at suicide. So there's 460 people who attempt and people who are successful at the suicide. So I think the statistics are staggering in terms of the number of people who die of suicide and the number of people who commit suicide. And the reasons for that range, but what we know is that commonly, if depression goes untreated, then it unfortunately often leads to suicide.
Now, obviously, there's another side. So there's the Western part when it comes to understanding and being able to interpret and dissecting suicide, which we'll touch base on. Then there's the cultural aspect of it, right? There's the African culture of it. And when we're looking at how people will often look at ukuthwasa as an option. And sometimes you've heard it amongst, even African people, they'll say things like, I feel like my ancestors have turned their back on me, or things are not going right for me, or I've been losing my jobs consistently, or I don't have money, and they get into a state of depression, and they feel as though their ancestors have shunned upon them, and therefore they must go and ukuthwasa. So then how then do you start discerning that that person is actually depressed, clinically depressed, as opposed to, yes, they need to go through the cultural practice of going through the ukuthwasa process?
Good evening. Well, it's always advisable that, when someone is depressed, you take the necessary steps to say, it's good to check with your psychologist, it's good to check with your doctor, and it's also good to check with your African traditional healer, because sickness and disease is a manifestation of what is not okay emotionally or spiritually or mentally. So I think that one should not just rush to say, it's ancestors, it's... I've seen someone that, for example, someone loses a child through death, or someone loses a job and someone is struggling to accept that, or someone is struggling to deal with that, and they just get a depression. You sit someone down and you coach them, things are going to be fine, and someone is fine. But in other instances where you find, when people have, for example, when someone has had an abortion, there's a whole ritual that you need to do, or a miscarriage, that helps to relieve someone of what we call a dark spirit that comes with death, So it's not just you depressed, amadlos, or its ancestors, and you leave it at that.
Yeah. And are people, we're finding that there's a place for traditional medicine and there's a place for Western, and there's also a space that exists where the two can actually collaborate. In a case of mental illness, because it truly is, we're dealing with mental illness, in a case of mental illness, where do the two worlds collide, and how do they collide, and is there space for them to collide, especially when it comes to treating? I mean, a 13-year-old, for example, just this week committed suicide because of cyberbullying. Do we turn around and say, no, that child though has got maybe ancestors that were not spoken to, or maybe the ancestors shunned upon that child, or that child was just clinically depressed and couldn't find a way of expressing themselves?
I think just with mental health issues, in and of themselves, if you look at them from a Western perspective, they're quite layered. So it's not just a simple thing that if someone has depression, then it's a simple kind of way to treat it. And I think something that's also very important to bear in mind is that mental health issues can be physiological as well. So someone who has depression generally has a predisposition, genetically or hereditary, because someone in their family has struggled with depression before, and then that is often triggered by life circumstances. So it's not a linear kind of thing that causes depression. So I think the first thing is to understand that. And then when it comes to the treatment of depression, because it's not that just because someone is depressed, they will commit suicide, as if the depression goes on for very long and it goes untreated. So the treatment of depression particularly from a psychosocial perspective, needs all spheres of life, or that person's spheres of existence, to play a role in order to help them to recover or to get better from it, because it's also not a overnight thing. So you don't just take a pill and you're okay from depression. It is something that, because it's an interplay between neurons and chemicals in your brain and emotional stuff, so I think it's a more holistic thing that the person needs to either seek help from their spiritual realm or the spirituality that comes into play.
I want to bring you into this conversation now. Can depression be cured via a spiritual or traditional trajectory? Is there a place for it? So if a person says, I'm diagnosed, let's say they go to a psychologist and they hear that they're clinically depressed as per diagnosis, can they go to a spiritual healer or a sangoma and say, I've got this clinical depression diagnosis, I need some form of healing? What is the traditional spiritual way in which I can obtain that? Is there a space for that, especially when African culture is concerned?
Absolutely. I mean, I tell people I was depressed from age 19 to age 30. And my healing came through my initiation, for example. As I've alluded earlier, that causes of depression are, they could come from whichever angle. And in my instance, then, it came from that angle. But a typical person, regular person that says they have depression, yes, we can treat that. Our understanding of depression is that once someone goes through a painful period, or a period that someone struggles to deal with or to accept, then you start a thinking pattern that says to you that you're defeated, you can't go anywhere. And our understanding is that pathogens begin to build up in one's energetic body, which we might call your spirit body. Pathogens begin to build up. Pathogens then cause disease. They cause the imbalance in the body, but it starts in the mind, then it gets into the spirit, then it affects the body. So we do have ways in which we can get rid of pathogens.
So we're looking at almost forming a symbiotic relationship between your mind, your spirit, and your body when it comes to that. And then there's another element added to it, and I'm referring back to this case of a 13-year-old, because, look, from a simplistic South African adult, it just sounds so crazy that 13-year-olds and even less are thinking of committing suicide. And then we've got the added issue around cyberbullying, which is then caused by social media. And we've seen a lot of times that people will even send Facebook messages as goodbye messages, or they will actually notify people that they're about to commit suicide, and people will either laugh or take them seriously, and then they actually go ahead with it. So then there's a social media aspect, which has brought the community closer together, but maybe it's even a tool for a cry for help, and in some instance it could be that final push over.
And I think the thing that makes it very complicated from a Western psychological and psychiatric side to be able to treat depression and mental health issues is the stigma that's associated with it. So, for instance, if someone gives a cry for help and says something on Facebook, often talks about death and that they want to end their lives, it's seen as, she's just seeking attention. Yes, and this person is just seeking attention. It's not taken seriously. And people often undermine that depression is actually a real illness. And I think the stigma around it and the way in which people talk about it and the way in which people conceptualize of mental illnesses and people who might even be sending out a cry for help is very problematic, in people then seeing it as something that's legitimate and that requires intervention from a mental health practitioner.
Yeah, very quickly, we need to know what are the symptoms. If there's a family member or if there's a friend and they're displaying symptoms of being depressed, what am I supposed to be looking out for as somebody who is a support system?
Addictions, addiction to TV, your phone.
To TV?
TV, yeah.
Okay.
People choose to preoccupy themselves with TV. So TV, oversleeping, addiction to anything, practically food. Then you've got your alcohol, depression, and the need to isolate yourself or to over-socialize. Some people decide to just fill themselves with crowds in order to run away from that. So there's just an abnormal behavior that you see in people that you feel someone has just lost balance. That's what you look out for. And in most cases, people are aggressive as well. You can look out for that.
aggressive, and then especially amongst women, because I see that even though with men we've got more success in terms of attempted suicide, but women as well are starting to come out of the fold where they will admit that they actually are suffering from depression. What are we looking out for?
I think the overriding feeling of sadness and hopelessness, that is what the kind of feelings that lead someone to having thoughts of suicide and ending their lives, is just the deep and overwhelming hopelessness and the feeling that there's no way out of their problem or there's no way out of their difficulty. And those are the big markers that often push people to having thoughts of suicide or committing suicide.
So somebody who's showing extreme behaviors of aggression or wanting to be isolated or wanting or feeling hopeless. And then on the other side of it, somebody who is overly social, right? Because some people would say, and I've heard this a lot, this person was such a jolly fellow, and this person was so happy around people and was just so sociable. How can they go and take their lives, right? So that's an indication that there's a proper imbalance.
Absolutely.
And then in that case, what do we do?
I think to speak to the person about it, because people are awfully ashamed about how they feel, especially as if other people view them as having everything together and everything is working out for them.
Yeah.
How can you be sad if you have a job and a fancy car, whatever it is? And I think people then often feel very ashamed about the emotions and the sadness, particularly that they feel, because they can't really pin it into anything. But to remember and to conceptualize depression as a real illness. So the same way that someone has hypertension or has diabetes, it's something that they can't just snap out of. They need treatment for it. They need to seek help for it. And I think it's the same ways in which we need to talk about all mental health issues.
Yeah, I mean, especially when it comes to this one, 40 seconds, right? We've got a suicide occurs in this country every 40 seconds. And at the back of it, every 3 seconds, there's an attempted suicide. So I do it again. 1, 2, 3. Someone has just attempted suicide. That's how scary and that's how real this is. Clinical psychologist of South African Depression and Anxiety Group, that's Charity Mukone, as well as Mkhulu Makhanya, who's practicing Sangoma, just giving us insights around suicide and actually how is it that it's impacting people every single day and every single second.